Well, thank you so much, Lori, and welcome to everybody to the Inventing America Conference. What a terrific first panel, and I think what we'll be talking about now will really build on that panel. It is really an honor to be here with such a distinguished group of speakers on this panel, but also with this amazing audience. We've got so many people here today who play such critical roles in the innovation ecosystem. So what we want to do today is talk about another very important issue related to diversity in invention, access to capital, and the patenting system. And part of the reason that we think this is so important builds on the work of the first panel. You heard from the panelists about the critical importance of invention and patenting to growing our economy and keeping it strong. This group of panelists have all done very important groundbreaking work related to diversity in those issues, in invention and patenting. And part of what they've done is they've identified gaps, important patenting gaps related to different demographic characteristics of people across the economy. And we're going to learn more about those gaps today from our speakers. And I think what that really leads to, an important lesson, is thinking about kinds of changes we can make to help unlock that economic potential. So that's, I think, one of the critical takeaways. What I'd like to do now is to introduce our four speakers, and then we'll have a moderated discussion. Please be thinking about what you'd like to ask them, because we'll certainly have time for your questions as we move forward. So first, I'd like to introduce right immediately to my right, Dr. Barbara Gault. And she is the Vice President and Executive Director for the Institute for Women's Policy Research, which is a nonpartisan think tank based here in Washington, D.C. Barbara's work focuses on policies to promote access to post-secondary education and early care, improve job quality for low-wage workers, and employment equity. And for our purposes today, Barbara led a team that produced a report entitled Equity in Innovation, Women, Inventors, and Patents, and she will explain her findings today. She earned her PhD in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania and her BA from the University of Michigan. Go Blue. And with the Michigan theme here, Dr. Lisa Cook at the far end is Associate Professor of Economics and International Relations at Michigan State University. Lisa was previously on the faculty of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, a National Fellow at Stanford University, a Senior Advisor on Finance and Development at the U.S. Department of Treasury, and she also worked for the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 2011 to 2012. Her current research interests include economic growth and development, innovation, and financial institutions and markets. She earned her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley with BAs from Spelman and Oxford. So we welcome Dr. Cook. Erin Kelly, we welcome her, is co-director of the STEM to Market program, the AWIS Accelerator at the Association for Women in Science. Her career has focused on diversity in business and entrepreneurship ecosystems. She previously worked for the National Women's Business Council, where she served as Director of Research and Policy, overseeing a portfolio to further understand how policy can support the success of women entrepreneurs. She earned her master's degree in international relations from Johns Hopkins University, her MBA from the University of Virginia, and her undergraduate degree from Mount Holyoke College. Welcome. And our final speaker is Alex Bell, soon to be probably Dr. Bell, who is a student at the Harvard Economics Department, study inequality and innovation. He's a fellow in the multi-interdisciplinary program in inequality and social policy at the Weatherhead Initiative on Gender Inequality, as well as a former National Bureau of Economic Research Health and Aging Research Fellow. He's the author of one of the important recent papers in this field called The Life Cycle of Inventors. Alex received a BS with honors in computer science and economics from Brown University. So we welcome all of our panelists today. First, I thought we would start out by trying to lay some kind of groundwork for the important researchers that the academics on our panel have participated in and written about and shared. And this is all very recent work, but what I'd like to do now is first, Barbara, how about if we turn to you to hear more about the research that you and your colleagues at IWPR have done on women inventors and patenting.
Sure, thanks. And it's wonderful to be here with you today. We did a report last year with funding from Qualcomm that compiled what we know about what is the proportion of women who are patenting, and what does the research say about why women are underrepresented in patenting. So what we found is that women are about 18.8% of patent holders. So they are listed on 18.8% of patents. So there's at least one woman. So that doesn't mean they're 18.8% of patent holders. It means that there's at least one woman listed on 18.8% of patents. So that's pretty low. There's a lot of difference in terms of the kinds of patents that men and women get. We did a projection where we tried to look at this rate of progress, when will we see parity in patenting? And we found that at the current rate, women would be patenting at the same rate as men in the year 2092. There was an interesting new report that we're going to add to our compilation that just came out at the end of 2016 from WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, that did the same thing but on the international scale. So they looked at, of all the patent applicants, how many of them are female, and they found that 29.9% of patent applications have at least one woman listed internationally, which is a little bit better. And their data is a little bit more recent. I mean, one of the issues that we've had is that it's very hard to study gender in patenting because we don't have gender information from patent and trade offices, either in the US or internationally. So WIPO also did a projection and found that women would reach parity in the year 2080. So I have a little picture of a flying car on my slide here because that's kind of the time frame that we're looking at. Hopefully by that point we will have flying cars, and maybe a woman will have invented one. But obviously the progress is too slow. And why should we care? I mean, does that really matter? I think it matters for a lot of reasons. I think we can't really have a strong economy when half the population or close to it is kind of keeping their ideas under a rock. So I think to get a really thriving innovation infrastructure, we've got to get everyone at the table. So next slide. This is also from the WIPO report, and it shows how different countries are doing in terms of the share of women that are inventing. And here you can see that there's huge international variation in the proportion of women that are inventing, which to me has a couple of implications. Like if you look at China, Korea, and Singapore, they're doing much better than most other countries in terms of integrating women into the patenting process. Are they doing this just to be nice? Are they doing this, for social justice purposes? Probably not. It's probably for economic reasons. And then you can see on the other end, I just put the worst performers up here internationally as well. The US falls about in the middle. Now, part of the story is that these countries have different industries that they tend to patent in. But when you look at China, Korea, and Singapore, they have more participation of women across all industries. And yes, it's dominated by telecom, and we've seen a lot of progress in terms of women's patenting in telecom. But across the board, they've done something better to integrate women. So I feel like this report is really important because it provides us some clues, or at least some places to look as to how are these countries doing it. The next slide looks at this same WIPO report analyzes women's participation by different fields of study or fields of employment. And we see that biotech and pharmaceuticals, organic chemistry and food chemistry have high participation of women as patent applicants. And we also know that in the field of STEM overall, that those are the areas where women have been better integrated. And the worst performing fields tend to be mechanical engineering, essentially. So I think it's very important for us to focus on the fields that aren't integrating women well. I mean, that's a part of the story, a big part of the story, but it's also not all of the story. This report also finds that in academia, women are much more likely to patent as a share of all patent applicants than they are in business. For example, business files many more patents internationally, but women are much less represented in business. So for us as researchers, this is fantastic because it allows us to see, okay, what is academia doing? Is it the tech transfer offices that are encouraging women in a way that's working well? How much of it has to do with the fields that they're patenting in versus the help they're providing in terms of economic support, in terms of information, in terms of encouragement or creating peer groups and networks. So we're going to be continuing to explore what models seem to be working out there. And another just interesting side note on this WIPO report is that they actually have information company by company on the proportion of women that are listed on patent applicants. And certain companies have seen a lot of progress. And I will call out Qualcomm because it's among US companies, it's definitely in the top few in terms of women's participation. And the amount of progress has been tremendous. So it would be great to hear from you all about how you did that. And to try to take those lessons and to share them and to scale them across the country as a whole so that we have more ideas contributing to the economy. And I think there's something that we all can do to make a difference. I was trying to think about, well, why do the people in this room care about this issue particularly? Why should you care? I mean, just think about it. If women were half of patent applicants, I mean, if you're a patent attorney, your client base would change entirely. Like, what if you were required to have half of your clients be female? Like, what would you do? It would change the way you do outreach and the way you recruit clients 100%. I mean, I think we're so used to the world as it is that it's hard for us to envision just how different it would be if we actually truly had an inclusive innovation economy.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And let's turn to Lisa because she really has done some of the groundbreaking work related to race and gender in patenting. Lisa?
So thank you so much for having me here, and thank you so much for this discussion. I think that if we go to the next slide, I look at this in stages. There is participation at each stage that's critical for the innovation process. So it's invention, participating in the invention preparation phase and the innovation phase, which is the commercialization phase, and I'd like to talk about the two. Next slide. So in terms of preparation for participation in invention, I'm most interested in, and my research is most interested in, those who are getting higher level degrees in science and engineering, and who's preparing to participate in the science and engineering workforce. So this graph shows you how that has changed over time for women. So this is 1966, when 9% of women had PhDs in S&E fields, and by the end of this period, it's 42%. Next slide. For African Americans, there has been an increase as well. Certainly, it's starting from an even lower base, and it's flatter, but still increasing. There's been a lot more movement with respect to master's degrees, for example. Most of the people participating in invention and innovation are at the bachelor's degree level. My research is focusing on a specific group, but this is the upper bound. So there's much more activity with respect to bachelor's degrees, and I'll say a bit more about that in just a moment. Next slide. So that's with respect to invention. So there's a gap with respect to invention, but that's not all the story. There's some with respect to innovation, and I'm saying innovation is just commercializing invention. So the invention gap looks like this. For all U.S. inventors, there are roughly 235 patents per million. For women, there are about 40 patents per million. This is the population of women. So for African Americans, this is 6 patents per million. So in general, there are fewer African American and women, fewer African Americans and women participating in the innovation economy, commercializing invention, and in the innovation process. So let's go to the next slide. So if we're looking at S&E occupations, this is the breakdown. So the majority of those participating in S&E occupations in 2015 would be white men, about 50%, about half. White women, 18%. African American women, 2%, and African American men, 3%. So this doesn't quite line up with, especially bachelor's degrees. So that's a majority of people who are obtaining degrees in S&E and science and engineering, and those who are participating in invention and innovation. Next slide. So what's the opportunity cost? So Barbara was talking about why we should care. So I'm an economist. I am thinking about the opportunity costs associated with not including women and African Americans. So how do I think about that? I think about it with respect to missing discoveries and missing GDP. So first, we found in my first paper on the topic in 2011 that mixed patent teams, so co-ed patent teams, are more productive than either single-sex female teams or single-sex male teams. So if that's the case, you would expect there to be, over time, much more integration of patent teams, but that hasn't happened. Hunt et al. In 2012 came up with a calculation that we thought was quite interesting, and what they found was that the underrepresentation of women in S&E fields makes it lower, GDP lower, the calculation of GDP lower than it would be otherwise. So it would be 2.7% higher per capita if there weren't this gap in patenting. We did a similar calculation. They used bachelor's degrees, we used PhD degrees, and ours is a minimum. So what I'm giving you is the most conservative estimate. What we did was we looked at PhDs, and what we suggested is that this is anywhere between 0.64% higher. It would be 0.4% higher, 0.46. Okay, let me start that again. A little under 1% higher to 3.3% higher if women and African Americans were included, and this is the lower bound. I'm being extremely conservative in my estimate. So what are the possible policy responses? So I don't think just about how government might intervene. Typically, that's how we think about policy implications. But I first think about firms. And the data sets I'm using in the survey of doctoral recipients from the NSF, most of the people who are PhD holders are in industry. So my question is what industry can do. Women are most productive at firms that are large, and they're medium range, but particularly at large firms. So the question is what's happening in the other firms. So not the smallest firms and not the largest firms, but in the middle. So I think that there are inclusive policies that could be implemented in those firms as well. This used to be the case at AT&T, when AT&T used to have a very generous and long-standing program to support women and minority PhD candidates. We can also look to government. So NSF and NIH have two different approaches to inclusion. NIH has gone through a very thorough review of who obtains NIH funding, and it found that women and minorities were less likely to get NIH funding, and they've implemented changes to address that. In a certain sense, doing more blind type work, being more inclusive in their panels, so they're closing that gap. NSF has not done that, and I think it is worth doing. There are two kinds of inequality that arise from that. It doesn't have to do with just gender and race, but also with respect to elite institutions. So you might not be getting the kinds of discoveries that would push GDP forward, that would push the economy forward, with there being so much munching at elite universities. Universities could do a lot more. I am the co-director of the American Economic Association summer program, and what we say and what we've heard and what a lot of evidence suggests is that you can't be what you can't see. And in universities, I think it's critical to have, in all the fields we're talking about, especially where science and engineering participation is falling, say in computer science, to make sure that faculties are putting in front of students those who look like the students rather than those who look like the people who are on the faculty. So I am offering a modest suggestion, and I look forward to the conversation about it.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Lisa. In the paper that Alex and his colleagues produced, they focused on some additional factors, different demographic factors that influence this patent gap. Alex, we'd love to hear more about your work.
Thanks, Holly. So the slides that I'm going to show you, is this on? Yeah. The slides that I'm going to show you come from a linkage that I did of US patent and trademark records to the tax data. This is very useful because it allows us to see a lot about who are the people that are becoming inventors and who are the people that are not becoming inventors. So the first slide that I have here is on the x-axis, I've plotted the parents' household income percentile. And so this would be the parents' income during the kid's childhood. And what I have on the y-axis is the outcome of the likelihood that the kid becomes an inventor. Inventor is defined as filing a patent at the US Patent and Trademark Office. And what we see here is that kids who are born to parents in the, let's say, the top 1% of income are about 10 times more likely to become an inventor than kids who are born to parents below the median income. This is a very stark contrast. It's suggestive of a potential misallocation of talent unless you really believe that kids who are born to lower income parents are sort of much less able to be inventors. So let's take a look at the next slide. This is what I investigate. So we link the tax records also to a measure of early childhood aptitude. So we have test scores in 3rd grade, which are actually surprisingly predictive of becoming an inventor, especially the math test scores. And the two lines that I've drawn here, the red line is for kids from parents from wealthier parents, and the blue line is kids from poorer parents. Again, we have the y-axis is the likelihood of becoming an inventor. And what we see here is that conditional on being very high ability, say having test scores that are more than 2 standard deviations above the mean, it's the kids from the richer parents that are actually more likely to become inventors. So here this, I think, really speaks even more to a misallocation of talent, that we clearly have very high ability kids who are not becoming inventors simply because of the sort of socioeconomic status that they were born into. What I've described so far is it's sort of speaking to the role of birth in the invention process. So the family that you're born into and the socioeconomic status that you're born into seems to matter. Let's take a look at the next slide, which is speaking more toward the exposure component of invention. What I have here is a map of the United States, and the coloring is showing the number of inventors who are, the number of kids who are born in this area, how many of those kids become an inventor. So this is not showing you a map of where do inventors live today, but this is showing you a map of where are inventors born. And what you see here is that there are some hotspots of innovation around New England, certainly the Lakes area, Midwest, also around California and the Bay Area. What's interesting about this map is that the places that are good at producing kids who become inventors are actually the places that have a lot of adult innovation going on. And what's striking about that to me is that's true even within technology category. So what I mean by that is that we see the Bay Area and the Great Lakes area have a lot of inventors, but in fact, if you ask where are computer inventors most likely to be born, the answer is going to be in the Bay Area around other computer inventors. And if you ask similarly where are sort of the drug and medical device inventors going to be born, again, the answer is near the Mayo Clinic, where there's a lot of sort of drug and medical innovation going on during their childhood. So the conclusion of all this, and I'll save the rest of the slides for questions if we need to, but the conclusion is that when we look at where do inventors come from today, there seems to be a strong role of birth and sort of socioeconomic status predicting who becomes an inventor, but there's also a role of exposure, which might be potentially more malleable through things like mentorship. It seems like people who come into contact with inventors are much more likely to be inventors themselves in that particular subject area.
Thank you so much, Alex. Erin, let's turn to you. You've really spent your career working on diversity and entrepreneurship and innovation. How do you see this patenting gap playing out in practice? What do you see happening, and what kind of programs have you been involved with to address it?
So the project that I'm working on right now is very interesting because the STEM to Market Accelerator is focusing specifically on women who are interested in commercializing their research, whether that's actually building a company based on commercializing that product or licensing it to another company. And then we're pairing that with an investor mentor program. So investors get to mentor the women participating in the accelerator, but then also the investors receive training on gender bias and rules or tools and accountability that they can bring back to their firms so that they can really take a hard look at how decisions are being made around the founders that they're encountering. And so the bidirectional mentoring is that the investor gets to learn from the entrepreneur what it's been like to come through, receive STEM training through university and deal with that culture, as well as encountering the tech and entrepreneurship culture, which both are have significant barriers for women and other underrepresented minorities. So we believe that this approach will allow us to reach influencers and spread some information about how we can do better around encountering women founders and other underrepresented founders.
It seems like a lot of people who look at these issues think, well, if only we had more women and people of color getting STEM degrees, for example, we could really make a dent in this problem. But I think one of the things you've all noticed, and people who look at this more closely see, that there are so many steps along the way that have some influence in determining who ends up inventing and patenting. And I'd love to hear more from any of you who want to jump in about those various different stages along the way and what you see from your work.
So I think there's a lot of opportunity in terms of policy. You know, we see there are individuals who, we know from the research that it's not just that particular founder. There's systematic biases and barriers that are preventing us to achieve our full potential. So we've touched on the mentoring topic before. Mentoring serves as a very important exposure to people who are doing commercial science, and they provide role modelship, which we also spoke about before. So mentoring programs, formal mentoring programs, are really important, but you can't just lay a mentoring program onto an academic environment where the underlying biases are still there. So there's very specific things that need to happen in a mentoring program in order to make it successful. So mentors need to be taught. Mentors need to be trained about how to be a good mentor, and that includes the social skills and ethical practices that they need to really be a good mentor to their protege. We also know that mentoring is not really a part of the tenure and promotion decisions. And so when senior faculty, they don't really have strong incentives to mentor junior faculty women and introduce them to the world that is commercial science. And so there's, you know, in the past, there's been this cultural feeling in scientific academia that, you know, for-profit companies are not the best way to get our research out there. And you can look at it in other ways. Well, it is, because then we are creating something that people will buy, and more people will buy it, and we're creating value for everyone. So a lot of women scientists haven't really heard or internalized that message. And so it's not a pathway that is typically talked about. So these mentorship programs that are talking specifically about commercial science can help women postdocs and women doing research in an academic environment go down the route of commercial science and start patenting. So supporting mentoring at an institutional level with very formal training and incentives tying into hiring and decision making is really important, because mentors can also help women access formal networks and develop informal networks as well. So we've seen from the research that it is more difficult for women to access these networks. And so specifically cross-sex mentoring is a really important component, because men tend to have more access to those more resource and more powerful networks.
So I think this is a really good question, Holly. Even though I'm focusing on STEM fields, I would argue that a big part of the problem is that a lot of the innovation doesn't come from STEM. A lot of the people who are innovating are not STEM people. So when I talk about you can't be what you can't see, a lot of people point to my friend Sheryl Sandberg, with whom I worked at the Treasury Department. And Sheryl was working with me at the Treasury Department. Again, she came through government, and she's not a scientist. And I think that if you're talking about creating successful companies and having role models as such, what typically happens to women is that they're judged by a different standard. So a different standard with respect to publication. So what we found recently is that women who published in Econometrica, one of our leading journals, were published 6 months later, all else equal, 6 months later than their male counterparts. So from acceptance to publication 6 months later, which feeds into this other problem of not getting tenure, not having the safety and security to be able to engage in commercial activities like their counterparts. So there are many things along the way. The other thing might be, not just with respect to STEM fields, but that maybe people don't know the data. So every time I'm in Silicon Valley, every October, I'm interviewing people related to my research. I tell them about this finding about the productivity of patent teams. So co-ed teams being more productive than single-sex teams. And everybody's mouth just drops. Like, you're kidding. How can that be? And, I'm thinking that a lot of people don't have this information. So maybe there needs to be greater flow between academia and the rest of the world to be able to change these policies.
And Alex?
I wanted to mention one thing that's related to Erin's comment about sort of the role of gender in mentoring. And I had shown that slide that was explaining that kids who are growing up around inventors are more likely to be inventors themselves. I wanted to point out that that's also true sort of within gender. So if you look at where are the girls likely to become inventors, girls in which neighborhood are most likely to become inventors, and you look at the adult men and adult women in their neighborhood, it turns out the number of adult men doesn't matter when you condition on the number of adult women. And then it's swapped for boys also. So young boys are growing up in places where there are a lot of adult men inventing, and conditional on that, the number of adult women doesn't seem to matter. And economically, this seems to be a pretty large effect. So if you took that correlation as causal, and you thought that girls were inventing more in some places because there were more female inventors, and that was really the sort of causal mechanism, then if you created a world in which the number of adult women inventors was the same as the number of adult male inventors, you would essentially almost close the gender gap among young boys and young girls for invention. So I get the sense from that line of research that the role of gender is very important in mentoring, in mentoring, yeah.
Yeah, just another thing to add to this idea around mentoring is there was a recent study out of the Small Business Association that looked at a survey of post-secondary faculty and looked at factors associated with patenting. And the things that predicted patenting were much different for men and women. So for women, having a postdoc was positively correlated with later patenting. Whereas for men, it didn't seem to make a difference, which to me supports that. There were some other interesting things in there. For women, having a small child makes a big difference, whereas for men, it makes no difference. So, you're looking at, traditional gender roles or the distribution of labor within the home, that sort of thing. What are we really going to do about that? But it does point to the need for childcare supports or work-life benefits in academia and outside as well.
And Barbara, what about access to venture capital? I know your report looked at that issue.
Yeah. There's a very interesting study that was written up in the Harvard Business Review recently out of Sweden, where some researchers tape-recorded conversations between venture capitalists and men and women who are applying for venture capital. They do that through the government in Sweden. And they did a qualitative analysis of how the potential investors responded to the applicants. And there were big differences depending on the gender of the applicant. And it was interesting, the same qualities were interpreted differently for men and women. So being young, for example, was a negative for women and a positive for men. So for women, it was they're young and they're inexperienced and they don't know they don't have enough expertise. For men, they're young, they're promising, they're energetic. There were a whole list of qualities like that seemed to flip when it was a woman. And there you're looking at implicit bias or unconscious bias, which I think is a really tough nut to crack. I mean, we all have it. And can you just be conscious of it and get rid of it that way? There's some evidence to suggest it doesn't work like that. So it has to be more of an issue of creating enforcement, creating incentives, and that's where I think people are starting to really question the Wild West nature of Silicon Valley startups and with respect to kind of a lack of traditional human resource policies. I think a lot of what HR policies do, if they're done well, is help you avoid that kind of bias by having clear processes for hiring, for promotion, et cetera. So I think that we're going to see that changing over time. I mean, we've seen this disaster at Uber, for example, because of just kind of a lack of respect for traditional HR practices that have been accepted throughout the rest of the business world.
And to build on that as well, it's very typical for people to have homogenous networks. So people, they're connected mostly to people who are relatively speaking like them. And what that means is you find people to be on your founding team or your first employees that are like you. So that maybe they're from your alma mater, or maybe you went to school or are from the same place. And so that is one thing that prevents more diversity among founders in this space, is that we haven't built heterogeneous networks, and so it's more difficult to find the people that aren't like you, but those people also can bring so much value because they're thinking differently from you.
I'd love to hear from our panelists what role you think the government can play. Are there particular policies that the government should be promoting? What role does the private sector have? Are there particular best practices that we've learned about? This mixed gender teams is a fascinating insight into something that has been shown to make a difference. What about universities? Are there certain things? Are there best practices? We've seen that the whole tenure process has implications for this. What are some ideas that you'd all offer about policies for dealing with this issue?
So as a person who's recently served as a chair of a promotion and tenure committee, I think there's a lot that could be done. I think that there is a lot of fertilization that happens between universities and firms, and that requires flexibility, the kind of flexibility that we've been alluding to here. So if there's something broken before the promotion and tenure process, that means that afterwards, where there is more protection for individuals to engage in commercialization and go between firms and the university, we're not going to see the end product. So I think that there has to be better mentoring, number one. There have to be people who are hired first. I mean, I have served on hiring committees all the time, and the social network part is a big part. So who do you know who can be effective in this role? Who's being mentored in formal and informal ways? And I would argue that informal mentoring is even more powerful than formal mentoring. I think some of the social networks that form early on, study groups. So study groups that become patent teams or become authorship teams. And what we find in economics is that most articles are co-authored these days. I mean, the increase in the number of co-authored articles has gone up exponentially over the last even 10 years. So there is a lot of coming together, a lot of collaboration that has to happen. So the better we understand how this collaboration forms, I think the more targeted our efforts can be. And that's true for universities, that's true for patent teams, that's true for firms.
Anybody else want to take that on?
Yeah, returning to the collection of data that we've talked about, we don't have a lot in terms of doing research on who is applying, who is patenting. A lot of that work comes from matching names of patent holders with known databases of, well, we predict Jessica is a woman and Michael is a man. Because the USPTO is in talks to collect that kind of data, but they haven't yet. And so it's difficult to get a really close-in assessment of what exactly is going on in terms of who is applying, who is actually receiving the patent, and then furthermore, what's going on with that patent once it's been granted. Does it get commercialized? Like, does that actually go to market, or does it sit? Because that happens all the time as well. We also, I think we discussed a little bit before, the data collection and transparency from NIH, from NSF, and the SBIR, STTR programs. Again, that's not really well understood. It's a little bit of a black box, and it's getting better, and different agencies are doing work around that. But the more that we can press those agencies to to release that information and their policies around outreach to these different groups would be very helpful in terms of measuring where we're at and how we can improve. There used to be in the SBIR program a specialized SBIR program that focused on bringing underrepresented entrepreneurs money. Now, that program was not used well and was discontinued in the 90s, but I think it's worth looking at again, given the available funding that is there. And it can be structured differently, but if we have ways to identify strong PIs and founders that might otherwise be overlooked, it could be an interesting tool to look at.
Erin raises this very interesting point, which I was not aware of until I started looking more closely into this area, which is the data is very hard to access. I guess I had assumed that the government collected this data in a way that would be easy for researchers to access. As Erin points out, this isn't the case, and these academics here have done truly backflips to figure out ways to access this data. So I'd love to hear more from them about the data challenges and recommendations for dealing with that.
Yeah, I mean, when we started working on this, we were a bit aghast that people were using name matching software to figure out both race and gender. And imagine it at the international level, too. That's how that WIPO study with something like 8 million inventors across 152 countries was done. They had software that matched names to gender. So, just asking that question on the forums would be super helpful. And I don't know that there are serious reasons that we can't do that anymore. I think, historically it might have been a concern about bias among the patent examiners, but we know now that there appears to be very little bias in terms of how many of women or race and gender differences in terms of the acceptance or the approval of patents. So that's one thing. And then we learned that there are some surveys that in the past, historically, had collected data about patenting, but they've stopped, I suppose due to a lack of interest among researchers or a lack of, I think we can make it known that we would like the National Survey of College Graduates to go back to asking about patenting, or the National Survey of Earned Doctorates to include that question. It's always a challenge because these surveys get so long, they're always looking for something to cut. But I think as a community, we can let them know that, hey, this is very important information for our economy and allows us to see how we're progressing. So, we're unfortunately stuck using extremely old data much of the time right now.
The one thing I would add to that also, in addition to the USPTO collecting information, one thing I've been pretty happy to see is that there's been a good amount of sharing of information, at least among academics. And I know one of the early uses of the patent data among academics was like a disambiguation. So people want to know how many patents did each person have, because in the USPTO data, you can't really link people across patents in a systematic way. And that was sort of an endeavor that got shared pretty widely. But I know that there are also these sort of like private commercialized data sets that maybe aren't really shared between the commercial sector and academics. So I think I'd like to see sort of even more sharing of data that has been cleaned and is accessible now.
Well, there's a slight problem with that in that the commercial software exists for a reason, and sharing typically means paying a license fee. And I think that there ought to be, either we ought to be given more access to their data, or they should be more willing to work with us. I think that might be the thing. I think we have to be careful about citation. Well, we have to be careful about collecting data from the USPTO. I personally don't want the USPTO collecting these data for the reason that I mentioned about NIH and NSF grants, because I think that does introduce bias. And what we haven't done systematically is to figure out whether there are these patent examiner effects on having this information. We know from so many different realms that it changes the way people see the applicant, so I wouldn't expect this to be different. There's so few of them that I think that it might be highlighted, so I'd be worried about that. I would be more enthusiastic about merging data sets, census data sets, other ones that would help identify people otherwise. I would also be careful there because if you're talking about small numbers of people, say Hispanics and African Americans, that can have another effect of exposing privacy. So I think we have to go forward, but with privacy concerns in mind. I think another thing that can be done with the NSF survey of earned doctorates, which is the survey that I use, they ask every year about patents. They don't always ask about patents that have been commercialized and firms that result from these patents. And I think that that's where the systematic mistake is being made. So there's a conversation there happening now at NSF, and we're participating, my co-authors and I are participating in that conversation to try to make sure that these questions are asked systematically and we can build a time series to see what happens to graduate students, well, to students, to graduate students, to professors who go through this path, or people who wind up in industry, who go through this system and how they contribute at every single stage.
Mm-hmm. I think, Lisa, you raised an interesting point. Certainly the issue of introducing bias would be a real concern. I know in a number of areas related to government collection of data, we collect it, but separate that from any decision-making about whatever the applicant is applying for. So it would be worth looking at those models to see how they're working. I want to open it up in just a couple minutes for people's questions, so please be thinking of that. And we've got microphones here. But as we've seen, the different researchers here have identified different kinds of gaps, and we can think about what impact they have on the system in terms of what inventions are created, what that means for the economy, what that means for our country vis-a-vis other countries. There's a lot of ways to look at it. I'm interested for all of you in what are your next research interests in this area? What else would you like to look at that you either are planning to now or in your dream scenario you'd like to or you'd like someone else to look at? Are there other type gaps? What are your research agendas moving forward? Alex, you want to start?
Sure. So I think that one thing that I'm very excited to research next, which was also sort of related to a question earlier on, is not just what's the gap in invention by gender, or by race, or by SES, but what is the gap in the sort of pipeline leading up to there? And how do you see that sort of emerging throughout the childhood and young adulthood and the college years, grad school, things like that? So I think something that should be high on the agenda is better understanding how that whole pipeline diverges for people of different sort of categories.
Mm-hmm. There's one paper that I have been working on for about 15 years that has been tricky to try to address, and I think it is now related to Alex's and Raj's research, and that's that I find that the thing that is most predictive of being productive in patenting in the DC, Virginia, Maryland area is how close people live to a Whole Foods. So I don't know what's going on in Whole Foods around here, but I think it again has to do with social networks, who you're running into. So what I find is that if you live in a more segregated zip code, so I was doing this by zip code when I was doing it, you would probably be on a patent team of one, and you'd probably be African American, and that's still true. For others, who live within some small distance of Whole Foods, you're more likely to be on a patent team with a lot more people, and you're likely to live in a not predominantly African American neighborhood. So you know, I set that aside because that was very specific to Washington, D.C. There are a lot of national labs here. There were enough African Americans to be able to capture, so that's why I focused on this region. But I think that in the survey of earned doctorates, what I'm doing now is doing something that others haven't done before, is that stringing together several waves to get a longitudinal study to figure out, again, what this pattern is over the lifetime of an individual, and an individual who's been participating in the innovation economy. So I think we still have the other studies have been snapshots, so what happens in one wave and so it's cross-sectional. But we'd like to know what happens over time and what affects their probability of success.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll second that. I'm not going to do it because I think you've got it covered, but that sounds like an amazing project and one that's really needed. My focus right now is really getting in touch with women who want to commercialize their research for my accelerator. And so I think there's a lot of questions that come up there in terms of how do we reach them? I can tell you recruiting for accelerators is challenging, and then recruiting for this kind of program, which is very needed, but also very, very niche audience, has introduced a higher bar in terms of the level of difficulty. But I would agree in terms of looking at the pipeline aspect. Just a personal story, I went to Mount Holyoke, which is a women's college, and there was a lot of, most Mount Holyoke graduates go on to do some sort of graduate degree or get a PhD, and a lot of them are in science. But there was not this, there's no talk of commercializing that science. It was all, I'm going to better the world using my science and not make money off of it. But that is a valid goal. And I would argue it can be a better way to get that innovation out there. So looking at the pipeline in terms of what are those inflection points that drive anyone, but particularly women and other underrepresented scientists towards that particular pathway. Because I think if we understand those inflection points, then it's a lot easier to create effective interventions that aren't necessarily, say, about money, but could be, but more about that role modeling and mentorship aspect that we haven't really unlocked and how to be very effective in a wide scale.
Same is true at Spelman. Yeah.
Barbara, did you want to talk about future research?
There are a few things on our wish list. One, I mean, you'd asked about what programs make a difference, what's working. I think we'd like to just do a scan of who's trying what's out there, what kind of results they're getting, whether they're evaluating and measuring changes over time, and how many women are patenting, let's say, in a technology transfer office. And then to kind of set the stage for wider, bigger scale evaluations that could potentially be funded by the government or NSF. Second, we'd like to do a survey of women scientists in R&D, women scientists working in both academia and industry, just to learn more about their attitudes about commercialization and inventing. Is it true or not true that they feel that their ideas, that they get proper credit for their ideas? Like if they're on patent teams, are they listed where they should be? What do they feel pessimistic or optimistic about their chances of getting venture capital? How does that connect to the real, what their real chances are in the world? I think, a lot of our data sources are pretty narrow in terms of our ability to understand people's experiences. And also, what are the cultures like that they're working within? Or are some of these cultures, say, where women engineers are working, hostile, dog-eat-dog? Does that play a role in whether they're patenting, whether they're commercializing?
Questions from the audience? We'd love to hear from you. Yeah. Paul?
Yep. This time I know how to do it. So I can't keep my mouth shut, and it's a genetic thing. I have a daughter who went through an engineering program in middle school and then in high school. It starts out with a number of girls, and ended with just her because she likes to speak her mind too. But basically, the girls were just ridiculed by these other kids, and the teachers didn't do anything to stop it. So my second daughter decided not to go engineering. She's going biology, which is fine with me, but I just thought I'd bring that up because you start bringing girls through and they get ridiculed by the boys because they're not loudmouthed enough. Is there anything you guys do any research on that?
I think that's a really good research idea. That would be interesting to look at in girls, how much they're being harassed, really. I mean, you can see it in popular culture. I have a 10-year-old, so I watch a lot of Disney Channel and that kind of stuff. And boy, being into science is social suicide. Like, that's probably a direct quote. Or math on these shows. So I just think in some ways we need to kind of address the way our whole culture thinks about STEM.
There's a lot of research going on among the learning analytics people, including at the University of Michigan. And what they're trying to figure out is why undergraduates leave certain fields. So engineering, physics, and unfortunately economics are right up there with respect to getting women and underrepresented minorities to leave. So what we're trying to figure out with these data is how we can change, how we can intervene to make sure that they don't leave. So it turns out for those three fields, we teach similarly. And there's no sense of everybody should stay in this field. Some people are prepared and some people are not. So I think that it will change with a culture shift and so one colleague in physics put together a chat room, an anonymous chat room whereby women could get homework help in an anonymous chat room, and they started subscribing to that much more than they would go see their TAs. And they closed the grade gap by doing that. So this is a big question that Claudia Golden is asking about economists. So why do so many women leave economics? So she's got this big research effort and big outreach effort to make sure that this stops, to figure out what's going on and to make sure that it stops. So we're looking at it, but it's going to take a long time to change the culture and coming up with these interventions and doing these experiments.
So I know that one of the computer science departments in either the UW system or the Washington State system, they had a curriculum where they had a weed out class, basically. And so at some point during sophomore year, you get this really difficult, let's make sure that we bounce everyone out who doesn't totally deserve to be here that we know of immediately. Well, they realized that that wasn't really an effective way of teaching and getting everyone who's interested in computer science the knowledge that they wanted. And so they took out that weed out class, or I mean, they still have the class, but they stopped framing it that way informally. And the number of grads of computer science went up by a third. So it was now a third of the class instead of like 10%. So there are some really interesting things that are happening in academic departments around the country who are realizing that this is an issue and that there are some fairly simple ways of looking at, how things can be taught and the culture that can be created so that we don't have this, we have an environment that is supportive of everyone. And then I think, going back specifically to more of the high school level, I think that teachers don't know how to address it. It's relatively new in terms of, we know that this is happening and we know this has happened for a long time, but now it's become really to the forefront that it's the role of the teacher to, talk about these stereotypes and biases and shut them down, or talk about them so they're out in the open and decide whether they're useful or not. I would say not, but so I think there's a lot of space there for more research into what is effective, and then trying some more pilot programs so that we don't have the situation where we have lots of girls very interested in STEM fields, and then through the culture that has existed, they decide that that's no longer something that they want to engage in.
We've got another question over here.
Yes. Hi, Mitchell Epner. I'm from Hughes, Hubbard & Reed, and I'm also here on behalf of the New York IPLA. I'm very encouraged in one way by the fact that this panel exists, and thank you for holding it. I also know that 27 years ago, I participated in a similar panel, and the numbers have not moved sufficiently, even though there have been a lot of efforts. So my question is directed towards what has been done over the last quarter of a century in order to study what's worked or seemed to work and what hasn't seemed to work, so that there can be best practices implemented. And I will give you a specific example from my background. When I graduated from college at Dartmouth, fewer than 20% of our engineering graduates were women. This year, for the first time, that number broke 50%. And there are specific things that have been implemented as best practices. And since you seem to be some of the leading academic practitioners in this area, do you know whether you or others are gathering best practices?
I think we need to do a better job, honestly. I know there is a body of research that's funded chiefly by NSF around gender and science in engineering and gender and race in engineering and other fields, STEM more broadly. I think sometimes that research ends up in journals or buried within websites, and that we need to kind of raise the profile of what is working beyond kind of just the anecdote at a professional conference that isn't public. And as we can, I mean, it seems like interest overall is increasing. That as companies are starting to release their data on how many women and minorities are employed, what they're earning, compared to white males and all of this, there's a kind of a groundswell of interest, and perhaps there will be some new opportunities to kind of pull those lessons out of the dusty shelves of libraries and allow us to bring some effective practices to scale.
So part of the STEM to Market grant, which it's a program funded by the Kauffman Foundation. We're running these 3 cohorts, and the goal is to pilot some things, see what works, and then the end result is going to be a program in a box. So I'm not sure what that looks like right now because we're not through the cohorts, but my vision is that it's a toolkit that we could go to existing accelerators and say, hey, here's this thing, let me help you massage your curriculum so it addresses some of the things that are barriers to underrepresented participants and founders, and then also how to do this investor mentor program. And I think that we're going to get more of those sort of programs in a box types of toolkits because there's becoming a lot more demand for it. So I think AOS has done a lot of work in equitable workspaces. I'm not really sure if we have a toolkit per se where you could take it to a department at a university somewhere and say, hey, here's X, Y, and Z that you can implement. But I think it's really a matter of assembling rather than creating, given all the work that has been done.
I think that you and I have probably been observing over time. When I started my career in 1997 as an assistant professor, I was told not to do this research. I wouldn't get tenure. Like, it wasn't interesting, so these are senior economists, senior well-known economists, some who are doing this research right now. I was told that I wouldn't get tenure, I wouldn't be promoted, and it was not worth doing. I think there's been a sea change in even the thought, number one. Number two, now we have the capability to look at these learning analytics data, and there are millions just from a single semester of physics classes at Michigan State University. You're going to have millions of interactions. And we didn't have the computing power, the cheap computing power, to be able to analyze these. And we didn't have, I mean, the question is being posed now, so now we're trying. I don't think that there's a body of research that says these are the best practices. One thing that I found immediately in the first wave of data where I tried to identify African Americans, women in the data sets, was that AT&T, having some association with AT&T and with NASA, was really important for women and for minorities in terms of commercialization and in terms of patenting. And I'm still trying to figure out why that is. Now I'd be able to do more of that kind of investigation. Same true with the Patents and Ghettos paper that I've been working on for almost 10 years. So I think that there has to be will, it has to be cheap to do, and there has to be demand for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one last thing in terms of you asked what's been done historically. I mean, there is a set of policies that you might sort of term like affirmative action or quota systems. And I know it could be controversial and there are pros and cons, but I think if you sort of take the view that this is like a pipeline problem and you're never going to have like female professors until you have female grad students, then that might be sort of a reason for some sort of quota or action like that. And that's definitely something that's been done.
I see two people who want to ask questions. Maybe if you both just put your question out there and then we'll have our panelists respond. Steve?
Great. So, so you guys are talking about later stage college, high school. I'm a huge proponent of the First Lego League, first program developed by Dean Kamen that really gets children interested in a lifelong STEM careers. Perhaps you could speak a little bit towards engaging our young women at an earlier stage, elementary, middle school, so that funnel is larger as our women move through the education ecosystem.
Terrific. And your question?
Sure, thank you. I'm Matthew Dowd. I'm a patent attorney here in Washington, D.C. And this topic really hits home for me because I have the pleasure of being married to a scientist and an inventor. She's a chemistry professor, and so she's worked hard over her career and done very well. But I have seen firsthand the difficulty of trying to progress your research, work long hours in a laboratory, get that tenure status, which is really critical in terms of taking your career to the next stage. And very often all of this occurs during the prime childbearing years of a woman. And I'm just curious, I think, Barbara, you mentioned it briefly, but if you could expand a little, it's a little different than staged on Steve's question, but in terms of best practices, have you studied that? Have you compared what academia does compared to private industry with respect to time off, parental leave, and then how it affects the tenure process, at least accommodating the fact that women in general bear the brunt of caring for children at home? Thank you.
Yeah, it's there has been a lot of investment in that particular set of issues, like the NSF Advance program especially has invested in kind of institution-wide efforts to do things like extend tenure clocks for new parents, create better paid leave programs, and they do seem to make quite a big difference. And one of the often striking to me findings about adult scientists is women scientists are much less likely to be married than male scientists, which is, to me, potentially, I mean, not necessarily a sad state of affairs, but is it that, if you're playing kind of a traditional female role in the household where you're both trying to work as a scientist and doing more childcare and more housework, which we know happens from time use data, that it just becomes more or less impossible. And the SBA study that I mentioned earlier about that looked at faculty members found that just the amount of time that people spend doing research is highly associated with patenting, and that women tend to be in faculty positions that involve more teaching, either because they're at less prestigious institutions that are, that are less likely to be R01, high prestige research institutions, or just that they don't have as much time. So that's one of the things that we've seen. So I think there's been a tremendous amount of progress, but you hear a lot about the promising examples, the great stories at the University of Michigan or at the R01s. I think it really has to permeate throughout academia as a whole. And on your question, I'm an advisor to a National Girls Collaborative Project, which is a network of programs that encourage girls to get into STEM. And there are tons of them all over the country. I think the place we need to work at it a little better is programs that reach low-income girls, girls that aren't in, in economically stable neighborhoods, and to be able to think about what's the full complement of supports that they might need that might have nothing to do with learning STEM, but transportation or just someone who's helping them think through the logistics of their lives.
There have been a lot of these programs, but they haven't been systematically evaluated. So in economics, we've had this CSWEP program for women in economics, and it has been recently evaluated. There's been this running experiment for about 10 years now, but there are very few programs that have been systematically evaluated, which means that the evidence is not going to be at a sufficiently high enough level to be promoted, to be published. I mean, let's put that aside, and then to persuade policymakers. And when I say policymakers, so deans and provosts and presidents and NSF and NIH to support this. So we have this endogenous cycle, in a sense, that needs to be broken.
Mm-hmm. I think also going back to those kinds of parental leave policies and those experiments, I think it's headed in a good direction with regards to the actual benefit in terms of parental leave, but the culture change around actually taking advantage of those benefits is not there. So, yes, you have the opportunity to pause your work towards tenure, but too bad for you if you take it. So there needs to be more, leadership and cultural change coming from the top in terms of, visibility and praise, for taking advantage of these things, as well as for, like I said, a culture of mentorship that changes the community in terms of how everyone is interacting with each other. I mean, yeah, academia is competitive because there's only so many tenured spots, but at the same time, we do have an opportunity to work together to create more innovation instead of competing ourselves to a lesser level.
I just wanted to also add to the question about what can be done to engage young women, because I do agree with Lisa's point that there are a lot of programs out there and they haven't necessarily been evaluated and whatnot. But one thing that I have seen from my research that's really clear is that kids are more likely to be inventors if they grow up in a neighborhood or a community where there are more inventors, and this is particularly true about young girls growing up with female inventors as role models, and similarly for young boys growing up with males as role models. So I think that speaks definitely to a wide class of programs and their effectiveness for mentoring and role modeling.
So if we're not going to move everybody into neighborhoods where there are either male or female inventors, we need to have a Hidden Figures movie come out every single year. People will go someplace and see these inventors and these role models. Yeah.
But more seriously, there could be efforts to sort of integrate communities.
I'm not playing. I'm not playing. I'm serious. I'm totally serious. There was a bump in the number of computer scientists number of students who majored in computer science during the Cosby Show, when there was actually it was a spinoff from the Cosby Show, where there was a cool engineer who was in the middle of everything. And we see that bump, but we're too, I don't know how I should say it. We don't want to study that. We don't want to study the fact that a television show, a popular television show, has resulted in this bump, and how can we recreate that? I mean, so I'm saying that there's a lot that we can do, and I don't want to underestimate what science fairs can do, sort of busing kids to science fairs, or having a Hidden Figures movie come out every year, or something like it come out every year.
So are you suggesting road trip to Hollywood?
Road trip to Hollywood.
Right.
I'd be there. I'd be there.
Well, I'm afraid our time has come to an end, but we have an offer on the table that I think Lisa has made to us, which is that we could have a higher GDP if we would just take this seriously and do more about it and learn from best practices. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for their work today.